I'm Amelia Warren, 35 years old, and after 30 sleepless hours traveling home from Singapore, I was finally about to step off the plane. My husband Daniel had been buried just 2 days earlier on the other side of the world. With aching hands, I texted the family group chat, letting them know my flight landed at 5 o'clock. My brother Travis replied, "We're busy, try Uber." My mother chimed in. "Why didn't you plan better?" I typed back. "No worries." But inside something shifted, like a door quietly closing. I didn't know yet that this day would end with my life splashed across the evening news. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever needed someone and they just weren't there. I grew up in a small suburb outside Portland, the oldest of 2 children in a family that valued appearances above almost everything else. My father Richard worked long hours in insurance, while my mother Margaret built her social life around neighborhood clubs and volunteer events that always seemed more about status than service. From the start, Travis was the one they arranged their schedules around: his baseball games, his science fairs, his weekend tournaments. My achievements were acknowledged, but never celebrated with the same enthusiasm. Still, I learned early to keep my head down, to work hard, and to tell myself that different children simply needed different kinds of attention. I met Daniel in college when he accidentally spilled coffee across my economics textbook. He insisted on replacing it, and what started as a clumsy apology turned into a dinner invitation. We married after graduation, building a quiet, steady life in a modest 2-story house with a garden I tended every spring. Daniel was a software engineer who could lose hours fixing a stubborn coding problem, and I became a marketing director who found comfort in structure and deadlines. We dreamed of traveling more before starting a family, and when Daniel was offered a 6-month position in Singapore, we saw it as the adventure that would make our future even brighter. I stayed with him there for part of the assignment, loving the vibrant city, the night markets, the weekend ferries to neighboring islands. We talked about a baby. We talked about where to put the crib. Then one morning he complained of a headache during our video call. By nightfall, I got the call that he had collapsed. When I finally reached the hospital 26 hours later, he was already in a coma. 5 days later, I was arranging his funeral alone because my parents said the flight was too expensive, and Travis said he had critical work obligations. By the time I boarded my return flight, I was carrying Daniel's favorite sweater, the watch I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, and every piece of paperwork needed to prove that the man I'd built my life with was gone. I thought coming home might offer a small sense of relief. But when I stepped off that plane and saw no familiar face waiting, just the glare of airport lights and the echo of rolling luggage, I realized the welcome I had imagined wasn't coming. When I stepped into the terminal that day, the sound of rolling luggage and boarding announcements blended into a steady hum, but none of it drowned out the silence from my own family. I collected my suitcases, one with my clothes, the others carrying Daniel's things, and made my way toward the exit. Each step felt heavier, not just from the weight of the bags, but from the knowledge that there was no one waiting to take them from me. Outside, a cold wind cut through my coat as I searched for my rideshare pickup, the glow of brake lights reflecting off wet pavement. I had pictured someone's face in that crowd, but all I saw were strangers hurrying to their own destinations. The ride home was quiet. The driver, a man named Paul, made polite conversation about traffic and how the weather had been lately, but left long stretches of silence where my thoughts pressed in. The city looked the same, yet different. Storefronts I hadn't seen in months passed by their holiday displays, already replaced with winter clearance signs. When we pulled into my driveway, Paul offered to carry my bags to the porch. He hesitated a moment before asking if I was sure I'd be all right. I thanked him, tipped him more than I could really spare, and watched his taillights fade until I was standing alone in the cold. Inside, The air was stale and biting. The house felt darker than I remembered, as if the absence had settled into its corners. I had asked my mother to turn the heat on the day before my arrival, but the thermostat read just above freezing. The mail basket overflowed with unopened envelopes. A thin layer of dust coated the dining table. The refrigerator held nothing but a few expired condiments and a container of something unrecognizable. Travis had promised to pick up groceries, but it was clear no one had been here in weeks. Too tired to dwell on it, I carried my bags upstairs. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed not yet, so I curled into the armchair by the window, still wearing my coat. Framed photographs lined the shelves. Vacations, birthdays, ordinary afternoons captured in better light. The house was silent without even the hum of the furnace to break it. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow sleep. I woke at dawn to an unfamiliar sound, a muffled gurgle from downstairs. My breath clouded the air as I made my way toward the kitchen. The sound grew louder, and when I switched on the light, my stomach dropped. Water was streaming from a crack in the ceiling, running down the walls and pooling across the tile. The cold had burst a pipe, and it had been leaking long enough to warp the hardwood in the dining room. Droplets hung from the light fixtures above each one, a reminder that electricity and water never mix well. I waded through 3 inches of icy water to the utility closet and found the shut-off valve. The wheel was stiff and cold enough to burn my fingertips, but I managed to turn it. The water slowed to a trickle, then stopped, leaving me in a soaked kitchen with floors that would take months to repair. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the drips echo in the silence, before I reached for my phone. Travis answered after several rings, his voice hurried. "Hey, can we make this quick?" "We're getting ready for that dinner I mentioned." I explained the situation, the burst pipe, the flooding, the damage, and asked if I could stay at his place until a plumber could come. He sighed into the phone. "Tonight's bad timing. Lisa's got the craft room full and we've got guests coming. Have you tried Mom and Dad?" My mother picked up on the second ring. "Oh, honey, we're hosting bridge club tomorrow. Your father's back has been acting up too. We just can't handle company right now. Maybe you should check into a hotel. You have insurance for that, right?" By then I was standing barefoot in water that had seeped into my shoes and socks. I found a packet of stale crackers in the cupboard and ate them without tasting a bite. The house felt colder with every passing minute. I decided to check the basement to see if I could get some heat working, thinking maybe a tripped breaker was the problem. The stairs were slick, the air damp. The basement floor was covered in water up to my ankles. I crossed to the electrical panel using my phone as a flashlight, and just as I reached for it, my foot slid on the wet concrete. My hand caught the metal box, and a jolt of electricity shot through me, sharp and violent, throwing me backward. My head struck something hard and the world tilted away. When I came to, I was lying on the cold floor, shivering uncontrollably. My right arm ached and tingled. A warm trickle ran down my temple, and my fingers came back red when I touched the spot. Each step toward the stairs felt like climbing a hill in a storm. By the time I reached the living room, my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the sofa. The air was frigid, my fingers stiff and slow to move. Somewhere in the distance, a high-pitched beeping began. It took me a moment to place the sound, the carbon monoxide alarm. I could see my phone on the coffee table, but my limbs wouldn't respond. Darkness edged my vision, and for a moment I stopped fighting it. The last thing I remember is a pounding at the door and a voice calling out. Then nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the living room. The ceiling above me was white, the light sharp but steady, and the sound of quiet beeping filled the space. I was in a hospital bed, covered in warm blankets. A nurse stood beside me adjusting something on the monitor. She introduced herself as Sarah and told me I'd been brought in by the fire department after my neighbor called 911. The words came slowly into focus: hypothermia, concussion, mild electrical burns, carbon monoxide exposure. She said I'd been lucky they found me when they did. Diane Foster, my neighbor from across the street, had noticed water running down my front steps and called to check. When no one answered and she heard the alarm inside, she called emergency services. The paramedics broke the door down and carried me out to an ambulance in the middle of the storm. Sarah explained it all while checking my vitals, her voice calm but firm, like she wanted to be sure I understood just how close it had been. Later that evening, the room filled with the muted sounds of a television somewhere down the hall. A local reporter had been at the hospital covering storm-related injuries. He overheard the details of my case from one of the paramedics and decided to follow up. Diane spoke to him outside, her voice thick with concern, as she described seeing me arrive the day before, clearly exhausted. She said she felt awful knowing I'd been inside alone. The story aired that night how I had just returned from burying my husband overseas, come home to a flooded, unheated house, and nearly lost my life. They showed the text messages from my family, the ones where I'd asked for a ride and been told to call an Uber. By morning, people across the city were talking about it. A hashtag with the words "No worries" started circulating online, and offers of help began arriving at the hospital. A plumbing company volunteered to repair my home free of charge. A restoration crew said they'd handle the water damage. A hotel chain offered to put me up while the repairs were done. When my family walked into my room later that day, I could tell from their faces they'd seen the news. Travis spoke first, saying it made them look like they'd abandoned me. My mother insisted it was a misunderstanding. My father stayed near the door, saying little. They explained that they hadn't realized the house was in such bad shape that they would have helped if they'd known. Their voices were hurried, almost defensive, as if they were trying to get ahead of a story instead of checking on me. The nurse excused herself politely, and for a moment the room was quiet, except for the monitor beeping beside me. Then my father stepped closer and asked if I was going to be all right. It was the first direct question about my well-being since Daniel had died. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the tray table. It was full of messages from extended family and acquaintances who'd seen the report and wanted to know what had happened. Some were angry on my behalf, others just curious. That night, I overheard my family in the hallway outside. They weren't discussing how I was feeling or what I needed. They were talking about what people were saying online, how it might affect their reputation, and how they could show they were involved in my recovery. My father suggested I stay with them after discharge so people could see they were supporting me. Travis argued that it might be better to post something together on social media. My mother was more concerned about what her friends from Bridge Club would think. The next morning, the hospital social worker came in to discuss a discharge plan. She told me that local organizations had offered to help. There was a grief support group, a meal delivery service, transportation for medical appointments, even neighbors willing to check in on me. "You have options," she said. "You don't have to go with your family if you don't want to." It was the first time anyone had reminded me I had a choice. My family sat nearby while she spoke, waiting to hear me agree to their plan. But when the nurse returned to check my medication, she looked me straight in the eye and asked quietly if I was comfortable with the arrangement. My mother answered for me, saying, "Of course I was." The nurse didn't look away. "The choice is yours," she said. I thought of Daniel, of all the times he told me I needed to set boundaries with my family. My voice felt steadier than I expected when I said I wanted to hear more about the other arrangements. The room fell still. Travis put down his phone. My mother stared at me in disbelief. My father turned from the window. "Amelia," my mother said slowly, "you can't be serious." After everything we've done, I asked what exactly they'd done. I listed the moments when they didn't come to Singapore, when they told me to get an Uber, when they turned me away after the pipe burst. My words were even not sharp, but they landed heavily. Travis called it unfair, saying they hadn't known how bad things were. I reminded him they hadn't asked. The nurse stayed in the room while the conversation played out standing quietly by the sink. My mother's voice rose, insisting that families couldn't drop everything for every crisis, that my expectations were unrealistic. I asked if expecting someone to check the heat in my home during winter was too much. No one answered. My father finally spoke, saying they understood I was upset that grief could make people say things they didn't mean. I told him I was thinking more clearly than I had in years. I'd spent too long accepting scraps and convincing myself it was enough. The social worker came back with a folder in her hands. She listed the details: 2 weeks in a hotel while my home was repaired, meals delivered, daily rides to appointments, and a support group that met twice a week. The restoration company had even offered to install a security system. Travis shook his head, calling it ridiculous to choose strangers over family. I told him I was choosing kindness over obligation. My mother gathered her purse and said they'd be waiting when I came to my senses, but not to expect them to drop everything again. I nodded and told her I never had. My father lingered a moment before following them out, but said nothing more. The nurse helped adjust my pillows once they were gone. "That took courage," she said softly. I didn't know if it felt like courage yet, but I knew it felt necessary. By that afternoon, the arrangements were confirmed. I would be leaving the hospital for the hotel instead of my parents' home. The first step in my recovery would be on my own terms. The day I left the hospital, the air outside felt crisp and clean after days under fluorescent lights. A car from the Riverview Hotel was waiting at the entrance, the driver holding a small card with my name. He loaded my bags carefully, avoiding the healing burn on my right hand. The ride was quiet, except for the sound of tires on damp pavement. As we crossed the bridge into downtown, the sun broke through a gap in the clouds, lighting the surface of the river in shifting gold. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and the front desk clerk greeted me by name before I could even introduce myself. She slid a key card across the counter and told me the room was ready, the refrigerator stocked, and my first meal delivery scheduled for that evening. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth, the hum of its machinery oddly comforting after weeks of travel and turmoil. Inside the suite was warm and softly lit. A potted plant sat on the desk with a card signed by the hospital staff. The window overlooked the river, its surface broken by small waves as the wind moved across it. I set Daniel's sweater and watch on the arm of the couch before sitting down, the weight of the past weeks settling into my shoulders. For the first time in months, there was no cold air pressing in, no water dripping through ceilings, no immediate crisis to solve. That evening, a delivery driver knocked softly and handed me a bag with enough food for the next day. The scent of fresh bread and soup filled the room. I ate slowly, watching the last light fade behind the hills, the city's bridge lights flickering on one by one. The quiet wasn't empty here. It felt steady, like a pause I hadn't known I needed. The next morning, I met with a representative from the restoration company in the hotel's small conference room. He showed me photos of the work already completed in the kitchen and dining room. The standing water was gone, the damaged flooring removed, and industrial fans running to dry the subfloor. He assured me they would also install the new security system and a smart thermostat before I returned. We went over a timeline for the repairs, each step more organized than anything my family had ever offered to coordinate. Later that week, Diane stopped by with a thermos of her homemade vegetable soup. She'd been one of the first to call the hospital after the news aired, and now she sat in the chair by the window, telling me about the street during the storm. Her words painted a picture of neighbors helping each other shovel snow and carry groceries. Until then, I hadn't realized how much life had continued on my street, while mine had been suspended in grief. Each day had its own rhythm: morning check-ins with the hotel staff, meal deliveries, occasional calls from the plumber or restoration team. Twice a week, a volunteer from the grief support group would stop by to walk with me along the river trail. We didn't talk much about loss at first. Sometimes we discussed books or the weather or the ducks gathering near the water. The quiet company was enough. When my family called, the conversations were short. My mother would mention a social event she'd attended, sliding in a quick hope you're doing better before ending the call. Travis checked once about the repairs, mostly to comment on how lucky I was that someone else was footing the bill. My father sent an email with a news article about home maintenance before winter storms. I answered politely but without invitation for more. By the second week, I could walk longer distances without fatigue. The burn on my hand had faded to a light pink, the stitches above my temple removed. On a clear afternoon, I took my coffee down to the hotel's courtyard and sat near the fountain. The sound of water moving through the stone channels was different from the sound in my flooded kitchen. It was controlled, steady, and meant to be there. One evening, as I was closing the curtains, my phone rang. It was the social worker from the hospital checking to confirm the date I could move back home. She reminded me that the support group would continue after I returned and that neighbors had volunteered to help with groceries or errands. The conversation ended with her saying, "You're not alone in this." The words stayed with me long after I set the phone down. The night before my move back, I packed Daniel's belongings into a single suitcase. His sweater still held a faint trace of his cologne, though I wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. I stood at the window again, looking over the water, the city lights stretching in both directions. The river would be there tomorrow, just as steady whether I stayed or left. The next morning, the hotel driver loaded my bags into the trunk, and we headed back toward my street. As we turned the corner, I saw my house from a distance, the front door propped open, workers moving in and out with tools and rolls of new flooring. It looked different already, warmer, more cared for, even from the sidewalk. Inside, the air was fresh, the faint scent of new wood and paint replacing the musty dampness I remembered. The security system panel glowed by the front door, and the kitchen gleamed with repaired walls and flooring. The living room windows let in more light than I'd noticed before, or maybe I was just seeing it differently now. I thanked the crew as they packed up their work boots, leaving temporary marks on the entry mat. When the last truck pulled away, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence I had faced the night I returned from the airport. This quiet was open, ready for the next part of my life to fill it. I set Daniel's sweater on the back of the couch, the watch beside it, and stood in the center of the room for a moment. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of Diane's laughter carrying from her porch, the sound of someone nearby present, even if we weren't speaking. It felt like a beginning. The first few days back in my house felt almost unreal. Every room had been cleaned, repaired, and put back together with care. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh paint and new wood, and the soft hum of the heating system was steady and reassuring. I moved slowly through the space, touching the smooth countertops, testing the new locks opening and closing cabinet doors. Each detail reminded me that the people who had stepped in to help had done so without hesitation or conditions. On my second morning home, a knock at the door brought Diane holding a basket lined with a checkered cloth. Steam rose from the bread she'd baked that morning, and she set it on the counter without ceremony. "Just in case you haven't had breakfast yet," she said, glancing at the vase of flowers she'd sent the week before. We shared coffee at the kitchen table while she filled me in on small bits of neighborhood news. The Wilsons' roof repairs, a stray cat that had adopted a family down the block, and the last of the snow finally melting. That afternoon, Robert and Thomas from 2 doors down stopped by with gardening gloves in hand. They offered to help clear the backyard of winter debris and check the raised beds I'd neglected while in Singapore. We worked side by side for an hour, pulling weeds and cutting back dead stems. The physical movement was grounding the rhythm of the work, giving us a comfortable silence broken only by the occasional bird call or the scrape of a rake on soil. Twice a week, I walked to the community center for the grief support group. The first time I stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and the faint sound of chairs being arranged met me. Eleanor, the facilitator, greeted me with a warm handshake and introduced me to the small circle of attendees. We began with simple introductions, each person sharing a name and the reason they had come. When it was my turn, I spoke quietly, unsure how much I was ready to say. But as the weeks passed, the group became a place where I could speak about Daniel without feeling the need to soften the truth for anyone's comfort. The calls from my family continued, but they stayed on the surface. My mother would mention that she'd run into an old friend, or that she'd been busy preparing for a luncheon. Travis called once to ask about the security system, saying it seemed like a fancy setup for someone living alone. My father's emails remained short, filled with links to articles about home upkeep and seasonal maintenance. I replied when it felt necessary, but the conversations never lingered. One rainy afternoon, a package arrived, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a stack of photographs from Daniel's colleagues in Singapore, pictures of the office gatherings, a farewell dinner, and a few candid shots of us from my visit. A note tucked inside explained that they thought I might want these as part of remembering the good days. I sat at the kitchen table, the photos spread out before me, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. By early spring, the garden began showing signs of life again. New shoots pushed through the soil in the beds Robert and Thomas had helped clear. Diane brought over a tray of seedlings, insisting they'd do better in my yard's morning light. Planting them became a small ritual, each stem pressed into the earth, a reminder that life in its own time continues. It was during one of these quiet mornings in the garden that the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was warm, someone from the university where Daniel and I had met. She had heard about my plans to set up a scholarship in Daniel's name and wanted to meet to discuss the details. We arranged a time for the following week. The meeting took place in a small conference room on campus. The walls held photographs of past graduating classes, faces lined up in neat rows full of possibility. We talked through the structure of the scholarship, the criteria for recipients, and the special provisions for emergency travel and support. Each point felt purposeful, shaped by the things I had needed and not had. Walking back to my car afterward, the campus felt different from when I had been a student. Then it had been about moving forward into an unknown future. Now it was about honoring a past that still shaped me. The path ahead was clearer than it had been in months, even if I didn't know every step. That evening, I sat at the dining table with the paperwork for the scholarship spread out before me. The last light of the day fell across the pages, and I could hear the quiet tick of the clock in the living room. The work was meticulous, requiring me to go through details I might have avoided in another time, but it felt right. This was something that would last beyond the immediate circle of my life, touching people I might never meet. In the following days, I received updates from the restoration company. They had finished the final touches insulation in the attic reinforcements and the plumbing, and a full safety inspection. The security system was live, the cameras set to angles I had chosen. It was the first time I felt completely at ease locking the door behind me at night. The next meeting with the scholarship committee was scheduled for early summer, with the goal of awarding the first grant in the fall. As the date approached, I found myself thinking more about who that first student might be and how their journey might carry forward something of Daniel's spirit. One afternoon, while organizing the papers for the committee, I came across the small leather journal Daniel had taken on our weekend trips. Its pages were filled with lists, sketches, and notes about places we had visited. I turned to a page near the end where he had written about wanting to make space for what matters. The words stayed with me as I prepared for what lay ahead. The house, the garden, the scholarship, all of it felt like the start of something steadier. But I knew there was still more to face and more to decide before I could call it complete. The weeks after setting up the scholarship were full of quiet, steady work. I met several times with the committee, refining the application process and finalizing the details. Every decision felt deliberate, each requirement shaped by the challenges I had faced during those months abroad and the return home that followed. It wasn't just about honoring Daniel, it was about making sure someone else would have a safety net when they needed it most. One morning, I received a call from the university's development office. They told me the first round of applications had come in and the selection meeting was scheduled for early summer. Hearing that students had already applied gave me a strange mix of anticipation and calm. I thought about the faces I might see in that meeting and the stories that might unfold in the room. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with ordinary tasks: grocery shopping, tending the garden, attending the grief group. Diane continued her Sunday visits, bringing bread or muffins, and Robert and Thomas stopped by with extra seedlings they'd started. The familiarity of those gestures had begun to form a new kind of routine, one not dependent on my family's presence or approval. When the day came, I drove to campus early, giving myself time to walk through the courtyard, where Daniel and I had once met between classes. The meeting took place in a long glass-walled room overlooking the quad. There were folders at each seat, each containing application packets and recommendation letters. As we reviewed the candidates, I listened carefully, noting not just grades and achievements, but the ways they had navigated setbacks. By the end of the discussion, we had chosen a junior named Angela Clark as the first recipient. She planned to study in Japan with a focus on cultural preservation. Her application included a section about her family's financial limitations and her determination to make the most of every opportunity. When the vote was unanimous, I felt a quiet certainty that she was the right choice. The award presentation was set for the following month at my home. I spent the week before cleaning the house, arranging flowers in the living room, and making sure the garden looked its best. The morning of the event, the air was cool and bright. A small group gathered friends who had supported me, members of the scholarship committee, and neighbors who had been part of my recovery. Angela arrived with her parents, her expression a mix of pride and nerves. We stood in the living room as I handed her the certificate. She thanked the committee and spoke briefly about her plans, her voice steady but warm. As the group applauded, I glanced at the empty space where my family might have stood. They had been invited, but had sent their regrets, citing other commitments. The absence didn't carry the same weight it once would have. After the ceremony, guests drifted into the garden, plates in hand. The sound of conversation mixed with the rustle of leaves. Angela's parents thanked me for believing in her, and I assured them it was an easy decision. As the afternoon light softened, people began to leave, offering hugs and promises to stay in touch. Later that evening, after the last dish was washed and the chairs stacked, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. On the table beside me was the certificate folder, its cover embossed with the university seal. It was a reminder of the day, but also of the steps it had taken to reach this point. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail addressed in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter, handwritten, not typed. He wrote about seeing the scholarship announcement in the local paper, about thinking back on the months after Daniel's death, and about the choices they had made. He admitted they had fallen short, not just in practical help, but in being there in the ways that mattered most. The words were plain, without excuses. He ended by saying that if I was willing, he hoped we could meet just the two of us to talk. I left the letter on the kitchen counter for 2 days before responding. When I did, I suggested meeting for lunch at a small cafe downtown. a place I'd visited often with friends. I made it clear in my reply that I wanted to start slowly to keep the meeting separate from larger family gatherings and to focus on building something real rather than returning to what had been. Our first lunch was careful. He asked about the scholarship, and I told him about Angela. He shared a story about his own college days, and we left it there. The second meeting felt less formal. By the third, we found a rhythm-short conversations that stayed present, not circling old arguments. It wasn't reconciliation in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, more deliberate. Even as these lunches continued, I kept my boundaries with my mother and Travis. They sent holiday cards and the occasional text, but the distance held. I had learned to fill my days with people who showed up whether or not they shared my last name. One evening I sat in the garden watching the light fade over the freshly planted beds. The air was cool, carrying the scent of the herbs Diane had helped me transplant. My phone buzzed with a reminder my flight to Singapore was booked for the anniversary of Daniel's death. The trip had been on my mind for months, but now it was just weeks away. I wondered what it would feel like to stand by his grave again, this time carrying not just grief, but everything I had built in the years since. The flight to Singapore was long, but easier to bear this time. I had packed light, just one suitcase with clothes, a small journal, and a few items to leave at Daniel's grave. Looking out the window as the plane descended, the city spread below in familiar lines of roads, rivers, and bright rooftops. The air was thick and warm when I stepped outside, carrying a scent I remembered from my last visit. Sea salt flowers and something faintly sweet from the food stalls. At the cemetery, the grounds were quiet. The caretaker led me along a shaded path to the simple stone marker. I set down fresh white lilies and the watch I had carried back to Portland a year ago. Kneeling in the grass, I spoke aloud, telling him about the scholarship, about Angela, and about the people who had stepped in when I needed help. The words came easily, as though he were still there listening. The rest of that day passed slowly. I walked through the neighborhoods we had visited together, stopping at a small cafe we had liked. The same couple still ran it, and they remembered me. They brought my tea without asking what I wanted, leaving it on the table with a quiet smile. It was a small kindness, but it anchored me. The next morning, I visited some of Daniel's former colleagues. They showed me the framed photo of him that hung in the office and told me stories I hadn't heard, small moments from their work days. His habit of bringing pastries to meetings, the way he stayed late to help others. Listening to them, I felt a mix of pride and something softer, knowing his presence was still felt here. On my last evening, I returned to the cemetery at sunset. The light filtered through the trees, scattering gold across the grass. I stayed until the caretaker began locking the gates. Leaving this time felt different. The grief was still there, but it was surrounded by something steadier. Gratitude, maybe, or the knowledge that life had not stopped with loss. Back in Portland, I settled quickly into my routines. The garden was thriving in the early summer warmth, the herbs spreading in neat rows, and the tomatoes climbing their supports. Diane stopped by with baskets of strawberries, and Robert and Thomas helped reinforce the fence after a section loosened in the wind. A week after my return, I met my father for lunch. We sat at our usual table near the window. He asked about the trip, and I told him about the visit to Daniel's grave and the meetings with his colleagues. He listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "I'm glad you went." We didn't speak about the past that day, just shared a meal, but the absence of tension made the conversation easier. Later that month, I attended a university event where Angela spoke briefly about her plans before leaving for Japan. She mentioned the scholarship by name, thanking those who had made it possible. Watching her speak, I thought about the chain of events that had led here, how something that began in loss could create an opening for someone else's beginning. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee looking out at the garden. The sunlight caught on the leaves, and a breeze moved through the open window. My phone was on the counter, face down. It would likely hold a message or two from my mother or Travis, short and polite. But the day ahead was mine to shape. I had plans to meet Diane for lunch at the small cafe downtown. Later, I would review the scholarship committee's notes for the coming year. The house was quiet, but in the way that feels settled rather than empty. There was still distance between myself and parts of my family, but it no longer felt like a gap I needed to close at all costs. The people in my life now showed up without being asked, and their presence had filled spaces that had once felt hollow. The year had carried me through more than I thought I could bear. Now standing in my own kitchen, I knew I was not the same woman who had stepped off that plane months ago. And though there was still more to come, I was ready to meet it. Summer faded into early fall, and the garden I had planted with Diane's help began to slow. The tomatoes ripened in smaller batches, and the herbs took on a richer, deeper scent. I spent more afternoons on the back porch, the air turning cooler, watching the light shift across the yard. Life had settled into something steady, quiet, but not empty. My father and I continued our lunches every few weeks. We spoke more easily now, sometimes sharing small memories that had nothing to do with the past year. It wasn't the bond I once wished for, but it was honest in its own way. My mother and Travis kept their distance. Their brief messages and holiday cards arrived without mention of what had happened, and I no longer expected more. The scholarship committee met again to review the first reports from Angela's time in Japan. She had sent photos of temples and markets, along with notes about the people she had met. Reading her words, I realized that this was Daniel's legacy, living on opportunity, curiosity, and the courage to step into the unknown. On the anniversary of my return from Singapore, I walked the river trail alone. The leaves had just begun to change, and the sound of the water moving beneath the bridge was steady, unhurried. I thought about the night I came home to a cold, flooded house and how far I had come since. The people who had shown up for me, neighbors, volunteers, strangers, had filled the space my family could not. They didn't just help me recover my home, they helped me rebuild my sense of belonging. That was the quiet justice I had found. Loss had not defined the rest of my life, though it would always be part of it. What defined it now was the choice to value the people who truly showed up and to let go of what never had. If you've ever faced a moment when the people you expected to stand beside you couldn't or wouldn't, I hope you remember this. Your worth is not decided by their absence. Sometimes the family you need is the one you find along the way, and when you do, hold them close. What about you? Have you ever found unexpected kindness when you needed it most? I'd love to hear your story.